The Professor's Digital Dojo.
Morning, everybody. Welcome back to the dojo. Today we're going to look at the anatomy of a shot part 3 using legacy render layers. Legacy render layers are a way for us to separate elements of our shot onto separate layers so that we have more control when we're compositing. Now, the default setup in Maya, if we go to Windows, Settings and Preferences and open our preferences, the default will be the new render setup system, which is very professional, very flexible. However, I find that it's maybe a little bit obtuse for people who are just starting out using Maya. And so I'd like you to switch this to the legacy render layers setup. You'll say just OK. You'll save your scene, close Maya, reopen it. And when you reopen it, you'll be greeted on your channel box and layer editor. You'll be greeted with a new tab called Render. And now, as of right now, we just have a master layer, which means everything that's in our channel box, in our outliner here, will appear on the master layer. However, the moment I start to create new and more layers, I have control over what goes onto each layer. So what we'd like to do is I would like to separate, if we look at a quick render here, I would very much like to separate the shadow from the stone. Let me pull that render up that I was talking about. So here we go. So right now we've got a shadow plate that has a displacement map on it to give us a bit of crenellation to mimic the stone surface on our shadow. It also gives us a bit of crenellation around where the stone meets the gravel. Now, it's not perfect, I wasn't going to spend too much time on it. However, we could play with this displacement map a bit more to really perfect it. But if you look at our alpha channel, you can see that we've got our shadow plate and we have our stone. And then the rest of our scene is a blacked out alpha channel, which means it will be transparent for compositing. However, to get more control over this composite, I would definitely like to make sure the shadow is darker, and I would like separate control over the value, hue, saturation, contrast, all of that stuff of the stone. And to do that, we're just going to start to place things on separate layers. Let's start with the first layer. So to put something on a render layer like this, I'm just going to select it. Then I'll shift select my shadow plate, and I'll go up here, and using my control key I can grab my skydome light, and I will actually grab my perspective camera as well, and that's just so that I'll have that image plane visible on the next layer if I need it for reference. Once I've got the things that I would like to populate the layer with selected, I'll simply come over here and hit this icon right here, and that will create a new layer with all of those objects on it. Now I'm going to rename it Shadow. No, let's do this one. We'll rename this one Stone. We're going to do the stone first. Once I've got this renamed, I need to start to change a few things around. So I do want the stone, and I do want this plane. However, I no longer want it to be a shadow plane necessarily, because we're trying to separate the stone from the shadow. I want the stone by itself. However, this plane does have a displacement map on it, if you recall, once again to give us that subtle texture that happens where the stone meets the gravel here, just so that we can get that same sort of feeling. It's pretty subtle, but it works for us. Now to do that, I'm going to first assign an AI standard surface material to what was our shadow plane. And here's what's cool about layers. If I go back and look at the master layer here, boom, like this is still assigned as a shadow plate. So what happens is whenever we create a new layer, if we assign a new material to an object on that layer, Maya will respect the fact that on the master layer, this is a shadow matte, and on the stone layer, I've assigned an AI standard surface material. So that's pretty cool. I don't have to do any magical stuff there. If I make a third layer and give this a different material, on that third layer, it'll have that material. Fourth layer, so on and so forth. However, now that it's an AI standard surface material, I need to do two things. The reason I turned it into an AI standard surface material is so that I could turn it on into matte mode. And this will probably be closed down, so you can just scroll down in your AI standard surface shader here, open up matte, and tick enable matte. Now, the one thing I will need to do is I will need to make sure that I right click and create a layer override, like so. And that's to let Maya know that if I assign this shader on another layer at the same to the same object, I can turn this matte on and off. So, and you'll see what I mean here in a minute. Now if I were to render it, you'll see that this is what we get. Hold on, let me go grab that render. Boom, there it is. And so now this is an AI standard surface material with matte mode turned on. And if we look here, we'll see that not only do we have our stone by itself, our background is so this is a perfect alpha channel just to isolate the stone. What we are missing though is, remember, we had a displacement material on our shadow layer, and so I do need to reapply that displacement material to this AI standard surface material so that it's behaving in the same way. It's once again pretty easy to do. I'll minimize this and we're going to pull up our hypershade and look at how we'll do that. So right now I have this AI standard surface material. Let me go grab, it's this one is where we turned it on into, if you recall, whoops, matte mode is on. And what I'll do is I'll also go get our shadow matte and I'll just kind of middle mouse drag that into the shot right here. And I'm going to grab both of these and map them out like so. The reason I'm doing that is I want to sort of get access to the displacement shader on, let me map them again so that we can expand that out. There we go. You can see this displacement shader that was attached to our shadow matte. I can now just kind of pipe it in like so into the displacement shader slot on that new standard surface material. And if we go back and I'll pull a render of this again, and now let's compare that render with our previous render. Pull that up here. And so our previous render, this is what it looked like. You can see in our alpha channel that, of course, the stone is isolated. However, we are not getting that displacement map at the bottom. Don't mistake this kind of jagged edge for displacement map. That is just low. It is just low resolution. I'm rendering these really small. Now, if I look at the alpha channel of the new render, you can see that we, of course, have that displacement map now. And so everything will match up, and that's an important thing for us to realize. Now also you can see that the stone is behaving a bit differently. It's gotten kind of a little bit darker, and that's simply because it is getting a reflection from here. Not a big deal because we're isolating these things out, so we'll be able to control it by itself. Now let's look at making the next pass, which will be for the shadow only. Alright, so I'm going to do a real quick kind of shortcut because I want the same things on my next layer. So I'm just going to right click and select objects in layer like so. And then I'll create a new layer and it'll automatically populate this layer, which we'll name shadow, with all those new objects. Now remember, they still have their same shaders. Maya respects that. This one right here, if you look, this has the AI shadow matte automatically assigned to it. That's because when I create a new layer, Maya will respect whatever the master layer originally was. And so this shader was originally a shadow matte on the master layer, so whenever I create a new layer, Maya will automatically go and take that shadow matte from the master layer. It's not going to take the AI standard surface material with matte enabled from the layer below. I know that can get a little confusing. With practice it starts to make sense. Again, Maya will respect the fact though that if I give this a different shader or if I do anything different to it on this layer, it will keep it on that layer, and when I switch through it will shift and give me whatever material I've applied to that surface on that layer. So right now we've got our stone. And what I'd like to do with the stone is I would simply like to turn matte mode on with the stone. So under the stone's AI surface material, I'm going to enable matte, and I'm going to right click and create a layer override. Now the reason I'm doing this is because once I've enabled layer override on this shader is original from the master layer. It's kind of the OG shader. If I were to go back to the master layer and try to render it here and look at it, you'll see that enable matte is checked on this as well. And that's just because this shader down on the master layer inherited all of its sort of changes throughout the stack. So I'm just going to go down here, and on the master layer I will disable enable matte, and we don't even need to create a layer override here because the master layer is the master layer. So just real quick to show you how this works, here on the master layer we've got the stone shader, enable matte is not ticked, and then if we come up to the shadow layer on the same shader, enable matte is ticked, and we're able to do that again because we created that layer override. If you need to remove a layer override, you can do exactly what I'm doing here. Click on that and remove it. So what that means is this is now going to render shadow only, and I'll show you what we're talking. Let me pull that render up, and here you go. So now if I look at my alpha channel, you can see that the stone is now matted out, the background is matted out, and all we have here are our shadows. Now this would look better if I upped our sample settings. However, I'm trying to kind of make these renders quick so this tutorial doesn't take terribly long. So this works out pretty well for us. Now there's one last thing we're going to do, and we're going to create one more layer. I'm just going to right click, and I am going to select objects in layer. That's my quick sort of shortcut, and then I'll create, there we go, a new layer for all of that. This one we're going to call AO, or ambient occlusion. Hit enter there. Now ambient occlusion allows me to do a pass where we can get a little bit more detail upon all the objects in our scene. And so what we're going to do is we're going to just sort of select our plane, whether it's a shadow plane, and we're going to right click this plane. Whoops, let's go object mode. Click, shift click, oh come on. Fighting a little bit here, and shift click, there we go. I'm going to right click, and I'm going to assign a favorite material, AI standard surface, whoops, sorry, AI ambient occlusion. And AI ambient occlusion looks just like this. Let me pull that render up. And ambient occlusion looks just like this. The ambient occlusion pass gets composited with all the other passes, and this one helps to give a little bit more surface detail and that nice shadow line that happens when two surfaces meet in close proximity. However, maybe you've noticed we've got that same problem from earlier. We really would like this to have that same displacement map. So we're going to do the same thing we did for the last one using our hypershade here. I have the map from the AI shadow matte, then the displacement shader that I used there, and I've reused that displacement shader in this AI standard surface. There's absolutely no reason I cannot also plug this displacement shader into the AI ambient occlusion pass. Whoops, cross that out. Sorry, we're gonna bring it over here, just make our lives a little bit easier. There we go. Whoops. Darn it. Sorry, I'm making a mockery out of this. Something as easy as that. Alright. Yeah, that should be good. Let me pause that for a sec. Sorry, trying to connect up the wrong things here. I'm going to take the displacement map. There we go. Something odd is happening, so what I'm going to do is just do it right. Maybe that'll help. Sorry, made a couple of mistakes, I'm tired, and there's a bunch of stuff on the screen. So I'm going to Control Z that just so you guys can see what I was trying to do. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to take this same displacement shader and simply apply it to the ambient occlusions displacement shader, so that now when we get a render, and let's take a look at this render. Let me pull it up. Our ambient occlusion pass now has displacement enough to give me like a little bit of shadow crenellation and all that. And so when I go to render, I'll be rendering these three passes. The stone pass to isolate the stone by itself, the shadow pass to isolate the shadow by itself, and the ambient occlusion pass to create a bit more detail. Now, let's set this up to render a sequence, all right? And this is a nice professional way of setting up for rendering a sequence. First, I need to open my render globals, or my render settings, all right? You'll notice each layer has the stuff on it that I put earlier, and then we, of course, have master layer. Generally, I advise people to go to master layer first to set up the fact that they're going to render a sequence. So frame/animation extension gets changed to name not number extension. Next, you'll put in how many frames you want to render. I'm only going to render 10, just so we've kind of got enough to work with here. Scroll down. I'm going to make certain that 1920 by 1080 is checked. The next thing I'm going to do is here in the Arnold render, and this is where I'd like you guys to pay pretty careful attention because things do change. Here in the Arnold renderer for the stone layer, these settings are a bit too aggressive. The stone by itself does not need this much sampling. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on camera AA and say to create a layer override, and I'm just going to sample the stone 3 there. For diffuse, I'm going to create a layer override. I'm just going to sample the stone 3 there. And for specular, I'm going to create a layer override just in case I want to change it. I'm going to leave it at 3 for now. However, there is no reason to kind of push specular up. So what I'm doing is I'm tailoring my renderer to each layer. That's also going to speed the process up considerably. All 3 of these layers will probably render faster than if I had just done the master layer by itself with those 5-4-4 settings. So next I'm going to switch from the stone layer to the shadow layer. And the shadow layer, again, I'm going to create a camera override, right click, create layer override. I'm going to do 4 samples here, right click, create a layer override for diffuse, and I'm going to right click and create a layer override for specular. And the reason for that is my shadow plate doesn't have any specularity, so I can knock it down to 0. And next I'll switch to the AO render layer, right click, create a layer override. 5 is good for that one because the ambient occlusion needs a few more samples. I'm also going to right click and create a layer override for diffuse. I'm going to push it up to 5. And for specular, I'm going to right click and create a layer override and bring that down to 0. Now, I haven't messed with AOVs yet. That's a separate tutorial. You can look up a quick tutorial I did about working with AOVs. But now if we switch through and we see our shadow, our stone layer, our samples are different for each one, and then our master layer, of course, is run here. But if we look here, the master layer is grayed out, which means it will not render. I'm just going to be rendering stone, shadow, and AO normal. Remember, I'm only rendering a sequence of 10 frames here. So I'm good to go. I'm measured twice, cut once. Everything looks good. I'm going to set this up to render. We'll go to our rendering menu, and under render, I'm going to open up render sequence. And I'm going to make certain that this box right here is checked, all render enabled layers. So since I have 1, 2, 3 render enabled layers, I want to make sure this is checked. And when Maya goes to render, it's going to start at the bottom of the stack and work its way to the top. So it's going to render 1 through 10, 1 through 10, 1 through 10, and it'll segregate them to separate folders. Really easy to do. Now I'm going to go to my Odin drive here. And this is where I put my renders, and I'm already made a folder called Boulder Tutorial. We're going to select that folder, and that's where I'm going to send all of these renders from this sequence. Now, I'm going to pause for a second, let this render through. It won't take long. We're on the big beast here. And I'll come back and show you our result. We'll do a separate tutorial for compositing this stuff in DaVinci Resolve. All right, that sequence is finished rendering, and if I bring up my browser here, I'll show you guys what that would look like. Pull up my renders here. you can see that under Boulder Tutorial, we now have 3 folders. Stone, frames 1 through 10, Shadow, frames 1 through 10, and AO, Ambient Occlusion, frames 1 through 10. Super. Easy peasy. Now I'm going to show a compositing video using Fusion in DaVinci Resolve as a separate video. So I'll probably double post it both under Maya tutorials and under the DaVinci Resolve tutorials. So look out for that later in the day. If you did watch this video all the way through, this should not be an issue. However, if you run into any problems, feel free to leave something in the comments. All right, guys, remember to like and subscribe. Appreciate it. See you later.